Today is the third week in our God on Broadway series, and today we're talking about the musical Rent, if the anthem didn't give it away. Rent is both an adaptation of Puccini's La Bohème and also an autobiographical account of what was happening in the life of Rent's creator, Jonathan Larson. La Bohème is about poor, struggling artists living and dying from tuberculosis in Paris in Puccini's time. Larson created his show set in New York City in the early 1990s during the AIDS epidemic. During the 7 years that Larson worked waiting tables at Moondance Diner and also writing this play and living in a very gritty part of Manhattan, he shared the hopes and the fears of the characters that he created. Larson lived with a collection of friends who were drug addicts and drag queens and hustlers and struggling musicians. These were both his family and his muse, while together they tried to survive amidst the AIDS crisis. Now, Rent is not explicitly about AIDS, but the epidemic provides the context for the whole musical. Most of the characters in Rent are HIV positive in a day when to be positive was essentially a death sentence. In fact, Larson gave many of the names to his characters. They were the names of friends that he had lost to AIDS. The overarching theme of the show can be summed up in a musical line that weaves through the score from beginning to end. It first appears about halfway through the first act. In the first act, we're introduced to all of the characters, starting off with two roommates, Mark and Roger. Mark is a film director who, after years of struggling for an original idea, has decided he's just going to film everything for a year. He's just going to start the camera rolling and film absolutely everything. And he chronicles a year in the life of this close-knit community. For Roger, on the other hand, this year follows a previous year where he refused to see anyone or even leave his room. After losing his girlfriend to suicide and learning they were both HIV positive, he's locked himself away, struggling to write one last song before his life is over. But as Mark starts his new film project, Roger is convinced to pull himself out of his room and step out into the world again, the first time to attend a support group. When he arrives at the support group, they recite an affirmation. There's only us, there's only this, forget, regret, or life is yours to miss. No other road, no other way, no day but today. And this theme weaves through the show. We hear it time and again. It's a poignant message for this community living so close to death. Many of these characters know that death is at their door. Their mortality is in every breath they take, and they've chosen to embrace each moment, to make the most of each and every day, seeing that it may be their last. As the psalmist says in Psalm 118, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us be glad and rejoice in it." There's no time to focus on the anger of looking back, how things might have turned out otherwise. Forget regret, or life is yours to miss. It's a message particularly powerful in the midst of the AIDS crisis, but how many of us today recognize the importance of that message? All too often we find ourselves stuck, looking back, regretting the choices we've made or what could have been. But what good is that? Yes, it's important to learn from mistakes and to change as we move forward, but if we spend our lives with our heads stuck looking over our shoulders, we miss the possibility and the blessings of now, of today. That's no way to live. Forget regret, or life is yours to miss. In Isaiah 43, the prophet foretells of the time when the people of Israel will be reunited with their God. A people who had been lost in exile would be embraced again by God, who would call them his children, his people, his loved ones. And Isaiah writes, "Do not remember the former things, or consider those things of old. For God says, I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." Every day is a gift of new possibility. We must make the most of it. In one of the songs towards the end of the show, Mark's character makes it clear that in a world that teaches us that you are what you own, these friends have realized that even their lives are not their own because they don't own the promise of a tomorrow. They simply rent their time here on earth. The characters of Rent take that message to heart, and they really throw themselves into life. And through Mark's film project, we're able to see so much life in that one calendar year. It's a life filled with love and loss, where friends stand up together against a corrupt landlord and then sell out and then regain their footing, where couples find each other and then are torn apart by jealousy, by addiction, and by death. When the title of the musical was first suggested to Larson, he didn't like it, until somebody reminded him that the other meaning of the word rent is torn apart. Torn apart. And that's when the title made sense. The shining gem of the musical, the most popular song, is the one that we heard in our anthem, and it asks the question, how do you measure a year in life? What yardstick do we choose to measure the meaning of our days? Sometimes we just count the time, 525,600 minutes in a year. And sometimes we use rituals to mark our lives, like weddings or anniversaries, or sometimes it's special events like the annual family reunion, or we mark holidays like New Year's or the solstice. Rituals and special events and seasonal change can all help us to mark life's cycle of change, but we also measure our lives in paychecks, in songs sung, in hours worked, in projects completed, in meetings, in phone calls, in emails, in texts. Right? In 525,600 minutes. How do we measure a year in our lives? And Rent suggests, how about love? Seasons of love. That powerful force that defines the time of our lives, like having coffee with a friend, or laughing with our children, or comforting someone who's in pain. Love. That significant measurement that holds and sustains us moment by moment, that has the power to bind us together in our hearts and our souls. We must measure our lives in love. And it's love that brings the friends back together towards the end of this year in their lives. This musical actually has two endings. In the first, Mimi, who has relapsed into heroin addiction, is found living on the streets, frozen almost to death, and it seems that her HIV will take her life. And just as in La Boheme, the musical appears to end with her dying, with her sometimes boyfriend Roger, the struggling musician, finding the words to his one song in which he mourns her loss. In Rent, though, there is a second finale, for Mimi revives again, and Roger sings, "There is no future, there is no past, thank God this moment was not your last." And then everyone joins together. There's only us, there's only this, forget, regret, or life is yours to miss. There's only now, there's only here, give ear to love, or live in fear. No other path, no other way, no day but today. The great tragic irony of the musical Rent is that on the night before the show opened, Jonathan Larson gave his only interview to the media, and then that night, Larson suffered an aneurysm and died in his sleep. But his show lived on. In fact, it went on for 5,123 performances and was nominated for 10 Tony Awards and won 4, including Best Musical. It also won a Pulitzer for Best Drama. And after the musical closed on September 7, 2008, Charles Isherwood wrote its obituary. Of course, the headline was taken from the show's best-known song, that ultimately our lives should be measured in seasons of love. Isherwood noted that those who were singing the parts in this show when it closed hadn't even reached adolescence when it opened. While they knew what AIDS was, they had no idea what it meant to live in a world where the only hope was a poison known as AZT, and no one even knew if it worked or not. But it was the only hope at the time. In his final review in the New York Times, he repeated some oft-cited criticism of the show, but with a candor that's rarely heard from such critics. He wrote, "One of the weaknesses that bothered me a dozen years ago, the ending that finds Mimi miraculously springing back to life, strikes me today as a flaw that Larson might have recognized, but couldn't bring himself to correct. The integrity of the art must have seemed less urgent than the priority of disseminating hope. The awkward affixing of a happy ending to a fundamentally tragic story was a form of a plea, a prayer, that life might imitate art. I probably rolled my eyes at the absurd resurrection in 1996, but this time I fought back tears." Perhaps today we are gathered in this place because we feel called by an urgent priority, the dissemination of hope. Larson did not live to see how his life's work was received. He never accepted all those awards, but the show lived on, and so did his work for him. As one who has witnessed how quickly those 525,600 minutes can pass, my prayer for each of us today is that we can live our lives knowing that every day is a gift, an opportunity to share a message of hope and live into our own seasons of love. Amen.